Hello everyone, welcome back to another Stratagoy video. Ryan here. I had promised I was going to be making this series sometime sooner than later, but life kind of got the better part of me, and I'm kind of glad actually because the Battle Scroll, as you all know, the big one just came out, which actually I was wrong about when I guess Jonas and I were talking about we did the OBR review, the full index review. I had said we had just gotten that last points update and rules update, which looked like it was a soft update, and it was, but I thought it was going to be the big battle scroll, and that it wasn't. So a few weeks later, we got the official big changes, which is good because now when I do the individual looking at each one of these units, we've got the actual points for at least the next 3 months or so, I think. So that's good. But sorry for the delay. So as we did with the index review for Idoneth and Lumineth, we ended up doing the index review first, where we focused on kind of an overarching view of the army and the index. And then we focused on some lists, but also 6 specific units. And we couldn't cover everything because the videos are as long as they are. So what we had done is we followed those up with a unit per unit deep dive into things based off of different things like the Huracan temple and the other temples for Lumineth, or in the case of Idoneth, we did the big guys just like we are today, although that was literally just monsters, then cavalry, and then infantry. So we're doing something similar with OBR, starting with the big guys. I say the big guys because the big units are not necessarily just monsters. For example, the Mortek Crawler is a big guy, I guess, because he doesn't fit anywhere else, but he's not a monster, right? And Katakros is also not a monster. He's infantry, but I think most people think of him as big, at least in terms of points investment. So anyway, that's what we're going to be doing today. Before I forget, thanks so much for all your support. If you guys could keep it up, help us get to 4,000 subscribers. We're getting real close. I think we're over 3,800 now. So looking hitting our next big milestone sometime soon, and let us know what you'd like us to do to celebrate. But anyway, hit the like, share, and subscribe, all that good YouTube stuff to promote the algorithm. We didn't get quite as much attention on the OBR index review as I would have hoped. I don't know if it's just we didn't get the right eyes on it, or if people just aren't that interested in OBR. I don't know what the situation was, but if in any case, feel free to pass on that video to other people too if you feel so inclined. Obviously, it's a little out of date with regards to the points, but obviously the rest of the rules are basically the same. So let's dive in with the big guys. So the series will be the big guys, like I said, and then cavalry/elite. I was thinking about how we were going to split everything up, and I think this is the best way to split it up about evenly. By the way, the big guys today will also feature a discussion of the 3 endless spells, just to tack them on somewhere, since Nagash is one of the better casters to get those out there, or even Arkhan, who's also in this video. And then cavalry and elite. I named it that way because we only really have 3 cavalry units in the army. That would be the Cavalos-oriented units, the 2 heroes plus the Death Riders. But I've always thought of the Morghast as basically cavalry, even though they've got the infantry keyword because they fly and they're fast. And then I wanted to lump in the 2 kind of elite infantry dudes, the Immortus Guard and the Necropolis Stalkers, in with the cavalry instead of the infantry, which already had Tyrannic Cohort, Mortek Guard, and then 5 foot heroes. And so I figured it would make more sense to put them on the cavalry side. Not that they're fast. But anyway, so that's how we divided this up. So moving on to a quick slide just to remind you how we're going to be rating these. We're going to have a star rating, kind of like a tier list, but not exactly. It's a rough rating out of 5 stars per war scroll. Keep in mind the meta shifts and thus opinions might change. Our different ratings will basically be 1 star means a unit it's best to avoid that unit. 2 stars is a suboptimal pick. 3 stars is decent in certain situations. 4 stars is great in most situations, and 5 stars it wouldn't hurt to bring it in every list. Not per se an auto include, but also really high. I'll also say a caveat here is I've seen other OBR lists that are floating around the meta. If you want to call it a pedigree, my OBR pedigree is that I am a newer OBR player. It's been my most played army in 4th edition. I've gotten about 23 games in, I think, at 2 tournaments thus far. But I've been splitting my 4th edition with other tournaments, other armies at tournaments. But I really care about OBR, and it feels very much like an army that works with my sensibilities. That said, the lists I've seen in the meta, we're going to have some differences of opinion. So if you disagree with me, just be nice about it. And I'm certainly not an end all be all about all this stuff, but these are my thoughts based on my experience thus far. I also haven't necessarily been playing all of the meta lists. You'll just have to see if you agree with me or not. But today we're focusing on only some of the units. So let's see what you think. I think the big spicy one might be my opinion on Katakros, but we'll get to it shortly. All right, so we're going to start it off with Big Boy Nagash himself. I know that this art is Arkhan. I'm only using one art slide for all these War Scrolls, so I decided to put him there because we just had Nagash on screen. So anyway, Nagash is obviously shared by all four of the Death armies, but I think you can make an argument that he's the best in OBR, which makes sense because he's the most expensive in OBR now after the Battle Scroll, if I'm not mistaken. He went up 20 points, and he went down in Feck. I don't know what he did in Soulblight and Night Haunt, but in any case, I'm pretty sure he's the most expensive in OBR. But that makes sense because he's probably the best in OBR. I've rated him 3 stars, and I'll get back to that in a minute. We'll talk about the star rating after we wrap things up a bit. But his regiment options is he's basically what I call a War Master type. He's also actually a War Master, which means, although this isn't always the case, he can take any OBR. And I don't know if every single War Master in the game can do that, but anyway, he can. And he can also take one Talix hero, which has now been upgraded to both types of Liege Cavallos. That would be the actual Liege Cavallos plus the named one, which is Archcavallos Xantos. So he can take 0 to 1 of either one of those two units, not one of each. So you get one slot to fill with either the regular or the named. Anyway, so Nagash, so the way these videos work is we're gonna have the War Scroll on the right, in case you want to see it for reference. Then I'm gonna share my notes on what I think about that unit, and then the next slide is usually their melee or maybe shooting output. So under notes, I said that Nagash is basically a build-around centerpiece. This is always the case. He's too many points not to be. He's almost half your army. He's literally 45% of a 2,000-point army, and he's just gonna suck up all the oxygen in the room. You need to protect him. You need to use him wisely. And he needs to be bringing enough value. And so I think you're already seeing why I probably gave him a 3-star rating, even though there are definitely, especially at the beginning of 4th edition, armies that were running 30 Cavallos Death Riders in Nagash, and they were doing really well. I played that list as well at a tournament. It's just he's kind of a build-around. And considering the way that we stacked the stars up, we said 4 is basically great in most situations. I don't know that Nagash is great in most situations. I think he's great in specific builds, and that's why the 3. But let's keep going. So he's a 9-caster unless he gets bracketed. So he doesn't actually get worse in output if he gets bracketed. He gets worse at casting in the sense that he goes down from having 9 spells to 6. I'll be honest, though, I don't think that's actually that bad because sometimes you're running out of things to cast with 6 spells even. So, 9 is definitely overkill. But we'll talk about that in a minute. And he's got a built-in +2 to cast unless he miscasts. So his cool rule, the Staff of Power, is basically saying if he miscasts, he still takes the damage, but he can continue to cast spells, which used to be the bane of Nagash's existence. Is because, say you miscast the first one, I think he used to be an 8-caster in 3rd edition. Then you would not be able to cast any of those other 7 spells, which is pretty brutal. He can still cast, but he loses the +2 to cast when he does that. So there's 2 things that are on or off with Nagash. Okay, one is either a 9 or 6 caster based off of how many wounds he's taken. That threshold is 10 wounds out of his 18. And the other thing that's on or off is if he's miscast or not. If he hasn't miscast, he remains with a +2 to cast. Not unbinding, not dispelling. Worth keeping in mind. And he does still take the damage from miscasting, but he does have a built-in 5+ ward, so that's nice. His other, he's got a bunch of rules, but another big one, Supreme Lord of the Undead is a once per battle, bringing back a whole non-unique death unit, non-hero unit back, which means you could bring a Mortek Crawler or a Gothizzar Harvester if you really wanted to. I don't think that's the smart move, but I suppose maybe if you're running out of options, like let's say nothing else has died and it's turn 4 or 5. But anyway, usually you want to bring back a reinforced big block of, like a hammer unit. So like maybe Morghast Archai, but probably Cavallos Death Riders is probably what you want to bring back. Which means if you do bring Nagash, you can think of his 900 points. As long as you can keep him live and long enough to see one of your units die, he's basically, you can subtract off of his points total the cost of that extra copy of that unit that you're going to get back. It does have to be summoned wholly within 12 of him and outside 9 of enemy units, so if he's surrounded, he's not going to be able to bring anyone back. So keep that in mind too. And there's no teleport for him. Let's see. So a modular War Scroll spell for offense or defense. So his War Scroll spell, not to be confused with an unlimited spell, which an official unlimited spell in a spell lore is the one out of usually 3 spells that can be cast as many times as you have wizards. Separate wizards, not as many times as you have cast. So an unlimited spell in an army that only has Nagash can only be cast once because he's the only caster. However, his own spell, his War Scroll spell, is unlimited in the literal English sense of the word, meaning he can cast as many times as he wants, as long as they all hit different targets. Unfortunately, the range for this is wholly within 18, which is totally acceptable for your own units, because that's usually the wording we see when it's targeting your own friendly units. You need to maintain your wholly within bubbles. That's fine. However, one of the 3 effects you can choose is to do D3 mortal damage to an enemy unit. And it's so easy for those enemy units to not be wholly within 18, but just within. And if they just changed the wording of that, I would have a very different feel on Nagash, his 9 casts. Why? So let's say you're running Forbidden Power, okay, with 4 spells, or the Morbid Conjuration, also with 4 spells. So you've got 3 lore spells, and then you've got 4 endless spells. So that's, let's say on one turn you're trying to set all that up. So that's 7. Okay, you do 7 spells. Then you could cast his spell twice. Fine. You probably have more friendly units that you want to target than 2. So keep in mind the 2 effects, the non-damage against enemy spell or enemy units effects that you can choose are to bring back a number of slain models equal to a wounds health characteristic of up to 3, or to give a target a 5+ ward. But Nagash already has a built-in 5+ ward and can't bring him himself back. So he is not one of your targets. So it means in that situation you'd have all 4 endless spells plus the 3 lore spells, plus he could do it twice, either on enemy units or on friendly units wholly within 18. And it would have to be units that aren't him, so he doesn't count as one of those options. But once you got an endless spell on the table, as long as it doesn't get removed, he can't cast it again. So for every endless spell you've already got set up, either through a magical intervention the previous turn or any other previous turn casting, that's just another spell Nagash doesn't get to cast. And very quickly you start to realize he runs out of things, especially if you don't have a whole lot of units that are wholly within 18. So anyway, that's definitely one of the reasons you don't probably want to bring a Kronspine Incarnate with him, because then you only have one endless spell that you're going to be able to cast, unless it really just adds a lot to your army, but keep that in mind. I do like his War Scroll spell. Giving the 5+ ward to your own units is really strong, especially considering the only way they usually get a 5+ ward is during the combat phase if you choose to use that ability. But what this allows him to do is, because his Relentless Discipline bubble is only 12 inches, and if he sends a block of, say, Cavallos Death Riders out into the field, this is a way that he can put that 5+ ward on them in a way that you probably don't have another hero in your list with the how expensive Nagash is and the Cavallos Death Riders and whatever. So there's no projecting that Relentless Discipline bubble anymore. You send him up the field, that unit up the field, and they've got the 5+ ward for that combat phase, but not only that combat phase, but they've also got it in the magic phase, or the hero phase, for mortal damage that's coming from spells. They've also got it in the shooting phase. So it means they've got +1 to their ward basically all the time, instead of just in the combat phase. What it also means is, because it's on them in the combat phase, even if they are within his Relentless Discipline bubble, that you can choose, if you got it on enough of your units, to give them the +1 to wound, which I would say 9 times out of 10 you're probably not doing unless you get that spell put on them, which is nice. So you get the best of both worlds. You're getting a 5+ ward in the combat phase just implicitly from getting the spell off, and you're going to get the +1 to wound from the Relentless Discipline. So very nice. He also has an end-of-turn auto-slay rampage. It's Hand of Dust. Basically, he has to target an enemy hero or monster that's in combat with him at the end of the turn, which means they got a chance to hit him. Like, he has to put himself into combat, and then they get a chance to swing at him, which can be dangerous, and is one of the reasons you might consider running a Mortis Guard next to him to improve his ward save to a 4-up, just to keep him alive a bit longer. But anyway, and then you basically do a 50-50 by hiding something in your hands, and they have to pick the hand that has the thing in it or not. And then if they guess correctly, their unit doesn't die, but otherwise it kills them. And there's only a handful of units in the game that don't auto-die when something like this happens. So it can be really strong. That said, I do think there's a risk of putting a 3-up save, 5-up ward guy with 18 health. That might sound like a lot, but this is a very deadly version of AOS right now. And there's a part of me that really thinks, it might not be worth the 50-50. It depends on what else he's in combat with. So keep that in mind. And then he's got a decent defense and output. We'll look at the output momentarily, but like I just said, he's got 18 health, 3-up save, 5-up ward. So, not complaining about that. And keep in mind, he does have the OBR keyword, so he gets to use all the battle traits, unlike maybe what was going on in 3rd edition. So he's getting, let's say, +2-inch movement or retreat and charge. That's in the movement phase. In the charge phase, he's getting +1 to charge or anti-charge +1 rend on his weapons, pumping him up to rend 3, which is not bad. And then he's got, in the combat phase, a 5-up ward, which he probably is projecting for other people if he doesn't get that spell off on them, which is a waste on him. Or you can give him +1 to wound, which is bumping him up from 3s to wound to 2s. So that's nice. A little 25% performance improvement. But let's look at his output. So if you haven't seen one of my graphs before, going from left to right, we're looking at these saves. I choose to go from easier saves to get through to the harder ones so that it decreases. I know a lot of other apps do the other way around. And then we've got a space there, and then the EV average is the expected value average, which is taking a flat average of all save values from 2 to 6. Some people take a 4. It depends on how much rend you've got, but generally speaking, this is somewhat comparable to a 4, but depending on your rend situation, can actually be worse or better. So like if you compare what it's on a 4-up save there, the output here is better on average, I think, against a 6-up, and gets worse. Maybe it looks like it gets worse against some other saves. If I'm reading that, it might be identical on a 6-up. No, it got worse. It got worse. So anyway, so you can see what the chart looks like here against expected value average. We've got 4 different stats here. Base, meaning he doesn't get any buffs. +1 to rend would be from the anti-charge ability from Relentless Discipline, but you could also see that as, I forget what the name of the spell is, Drain Vitality maybe, which gives them a -1 to hit, I want to say, and -1 save. So maybe you got that off. Maybe you've got a Purple Sun off in the area. So +1 to rend effectively is not that hard to get. Then +1 to hit would be coming from an all-out attack. The reason I put that in there, I don't usually like to do all-out attack on these because we got so many other things to look at, and any unit could get all-out attack. The reason I don't usually put it on there, the reason I did put it on there this time is because +1 to hit, we're going to be comparing these WARSCROLLS, these outputs, to Katakros and Arkhan, which can both make use of empowered Naderite weapons, which is functionally a +1 to hit, because if you improve a crit exploding hits by 1 die roll, essentially a +1 on a die roll, so going from a 6 to a 5, which applies to them, not Nagash, because he doesn't have crit 2 hits, it functionally acts as +1 to hit, and so I'm lumping that into that category. Anyway, and then if you get both, and they both can have access to that, so I threw it in here. Anyway, so what we're seeing here is that if he gets everything off, he's getting off against all saves average about 13 damage, which isn't bad, but he costs 900 points, and that's what the table in the bottom right is referring to. So I took the 4 units we're going to be looking at, their melee output of the non-endless spells in this video. That's namely Nagash, Arkhan, Katakros, and then the Gothizzar Harvester. And then what we're seeing here is they're scaling on their base profile, not with all the buffs, for damage per 100 points investment. So Nagash is clearly the worst. And so unlike the charts that I've done in the past, I'm going to keep them in the same order here. And then, so if it says not any under change, that means that's the unit we're referencing. And then what we're looking at is what Nagash's profile is in comparison to, say, Arkhan. So he's 51% worse than Arkhan's output, 117% worse than Katakros, which is more than double. And then 246% worse than a Harvester per point, per 100 points, or per point, but 100 points is what the units we're looking at in the second column there. So anyway, you're not really taking them for melee, but it's just good to know. And it's also worth pointing out, I scaled the graph above from 0 to 20 because that's what we needed for Katakros, who did the most output raw damage. So that's why I've scaled everything to 20 so that you can kind of do a side-by-side comparison. Okay, so that's Nagash. Again, the reason I said he's a 3 is I think you have to build around him, and that's just not for every list. A 3-star is kind of like, could be a fantastic unit that you have to build around. Do I think he's great? Yes. Do I think you're playing a very risky game by not only going super elite, but also by probably not having any other heroes, and you really need to start maybe thinking about points to invest in protecting him, but then that's taking points away from actually building up your hammers. It's kind of a touch and go kind of thing. And I think it's a fine line between over-investing in Nagash and supporting him and then not doing enough. So keep that in mind. All right. Moving on to Arkhan. Arkhan, as you see here, is a 5-star. And I'll go ahead and tell you he's my favorite. I'll give my reasons for Arkhan after I've talked about him. But I'll go ahead and tell you right now, I scored him higher than even Katakros, who seems to be more popular in the meta, but I have my reasons, so we'll get to it later. Arkhan's 410 points, so out of the 3 War Masters we actually have in the army, as in they have the actual War Master keyword, not just War Master type, which is my kind of wording for a unit that can take anything in the army, he's the cheapest of the 3. He has the same things he can bring in his regiment as Nagash, namely any OBR plus 0 to 1 of either one of the Leech Cavallos. He's basically a mini Nagash, which is what I said under the notes here, for less than half the price. Why? I mean, he kind of looks even like Nagash. He's a 3-caster with a +1 to cast, which he heals every time he casts. Now, granted, that's a third of the amount of spells that Nagash can cast, and he's half as much of the plus what X to cast. But sometimes you don't really need more than about 3 spells anyway. And considering he's half the price, you could bring another caster. You can bring another like a Leash Cavallos or something pretty easily and still have a 1-drop list if you really want. He's bringing a lot of value. He's 2 inches faster than Nagash, which is something I'm going to talk about a little bit below. So let me not skip ahead. Arkhan's basically got a holier than 18 4-up spell ignore, which is fantastic. It's basically like a walking version of Null Myriad. Granted, I think that was on a 2-up at one point. But he's great to keep or up with your army, not only your army in general, but also your cav, which is such an important part of the army right now. Or if you go with Morghast, they also are as fast as the Death Riders. So I've said here he's a fast, relentless, disciplined locust for cav because he can keep up. He's actually 2 inches faster. And he's not bad in combat. He can stay alive. Especially if he's going into a hero, he's doing double the amount of mortal damage he would with his impact hits, which means he can one-shot some small heroes or finish off a hero without even having to worry about getting slapped back, which is pretty good. And he's got a little more damage output with his spell, Curse of Years, which I've named here a swingy War Scroll spell. The way it works is you pick a visible enemy unit with an 18, you roll 10 dice for each 6 you get on the die. It does 1 mortal damage. And then for each one of those dice that was successfully doing a mortal damage, you get to roll it again. Then you get to do it on 5s, and for each of those, you repeat the process. And then you get to do it on 4s, then 3s, then 2s. Now, back in the day, as in 3rd edition, it used to keep going. Now it stops once you hit 2s. I think on average, it does something around 2 upper 2s, 3 mortal damage. It's not as much as you would hope, and it's super swingy. I've barely. Maybe I've seen it go to twos once in the games I've played with him, and almost every game I've played has been with Arkhan, by the way. Once I switched off the Nagash build, so I guess that's probably like about 15-ish games, um, and it just doesn't. Maybe you're choosing other spells because remember the spell lore is pretty good. I mean, you've got Empower Naderite weapons for giving crits on fives. You've got the Drain Vitality, I think it's called, for -1 to hit and -1 save. And then you've got an anti-horde spell on a 5-up. Plus, you're trying to get your endless spells out. Maybe Curse of Years is kind of more of a fallback option. It's great if you're on kind of a Hail Mary thing. If you only need to do 1 or 2 wounds, obviously that's fantastic. It's more reliable, I guess, than especially for 1 wound, than doing the anti-horde spell on a single target. But it's still a little bit of a long shot. So let's take a look at his output. Again, scaled for Katakros, basically. He's doing less. Right now, I decided not to give the same buffs to him because he's just outside of being a good enough melee piece that I don't think you're probably going to be throwing, say, crit 2 hits on 5s with Empower Naderite weapons on him. You're not going to be probably blowing your auto attack on him. He probably needs to stay alive since he's not Nagash. He's not going to be giving out a 5+ ward with his spell. So he's probably choosing that in combat. So you're not getting +1 to wound. So instead, I just went with his base output and then his impact hits against non-heroes and his impact against a hero. I said against a hero or monster, but if we take a look at the War Scroll, it's actually just against a hero. So that he gets the extra stuff. So ignore that part. It's not a monster. But anyway, the output here is maxing out if he happens to get a charge off. He's getting at just shy of 10 on average against all saves against a hero. Again, not a monster. And then if he's not getting any of that stuff off, like he's not charging, he's like probably 6.5 or something like that. Not particularly impressive for 410 points, which brings us to the damage per 100 points. He's obviously the second on the list. He's 34% better than Nagash per 100 points, 43% worse than Katakros, and 129% worse than the Harvester. So a little over half as good as the Harvester. So anyway, you're not really taking for that, but it's the other stuff that makes him so good. Now, why did I say he was a 5-star unit? Well, OBR is pretty elite, and you need something that can keep putting out your relentless disembodied points. Or not points, but your abilities. You need something that can keep up with your actual hammers, which I can tell you right now, it's not going to be your infantry units, or at least your slow infantry units. Like the Morgas Archive are pretty good. Harbingers can do it too, that they're just really easy to kill. And he's giving you 3 casts with a +1 to cast, which is really efficient. He's got the spell ignore. He's not bad in combat. His base is bigger, so he's projecting a bigger bubble. I personally think, especially when endless spells are so important right now, and unbinding things, and just everything that a wizard's bringing to the table, that he's bringing just the slightest bit more value than Katakros. I think there is an argument for Katakros. I'm going to be making it shortly, but I think for me, Arkhan is a 5-star unit. Like, you could take him in every single one of your builds, and you're not going to be upset about it. He's 110 points cheaper than Katakros now, which he used to be 90, but now Katakros went up 20 and Arkhan stayed the same. That 110 points could be spent somewhere else for sure. I don't know. I just think, I know this is the big spicy thing, I guess, that I think the meta might not agree with me on, but I think in the long run, points staying the same and the game staying the same, Arkhan is actually, if you only get to choose one hero, Arkhan's the one you go with. Because the point I'm going to make about Katakros is that because you don't have a single wizard in the list, if you just take him, or you just take him in Elish Kavalos, you are going to have to pay another tax of at least 110 points to take an Ossiarch or a Soul Reaper at this point. So that's another 110 points more expensive than Arkhan just to get a 1-caster. You can take a Soul Mason for 160 points for your cheapest 2-caster, which is the most efficient way to get a cast in the army. And that's a totally fine thing, but that's another 160 point tax that we're looking at. And Arkhan is wrapping a whole bunch of stuff up, plus being able to keep up with your cav, which even though Katakros has an 18-inch Holy Then bubble, which we'll talk about shortly, of course, he's only moving 4 inches. And I don't know. I think it's also a matter of what kind of playstyle you're trying to do. I really like Arkhan, especially with the +1 to cast. So that's my final verdict on him. I think he's just a nudge better than Katakros. And if you only take one hero, I think he's easily the best one to take in the army. But on to Katakros himself. So he's 520 points. He has the same exact regiment options as Nagash and Arkhan. Now, he, like I just mentioned, he's got a holier than 18 relentless discipline locus, if you want, which means even though he's slow, he's on a big base as well. I guess he's on the same base. It just doesn't feel like it, maybe because he's not flying. His model is more condensed. He's got 20 health, which is nice on a 3-up save, but he's only moving those 4 inches, so he's having a hard time keeping up. That said, he does have control 5, which I'll kind of talk about how they equate the math for that in a second. He's got a command ability. This is, I think, one of the main reasons people are taking him. He's got a command ability for 3 units, which could be him and 2 other units, or whatever combination you want, that are holier than 18 of him at the moment of issuing it, and also are holier than 18 of him at the moment they need to use this to get +1 save. So basically, in your hero phase, you pay a CP, you pay a command point to issue this. You can give it to 3 units, and then you can send them out in the field, but it's only good if they are still within holier than 18 at the moment that they need to use it, the +1 to save. So, if for one reason or the other Katakros gets stuck, let's say someone Bellicores him and he can't move, but your other unit can, then your other unit, if they want to keep using that +1 to save, has to be more conservative with their movement. Now, the thing about Katakros's movement is you're probably going to be using the +2 inch movement on Relentless Discipline, right? And you're moving him up the field, so that gets him up to 6 inches. And I would argue you might need to auto run him every single turn to make sure you're getting 12 inches worth of movement to make sure he's keeping up, projecting that bubble until he gets into the middle of the field, which, unless you need to really spread out, to make sure he's applying that 18-inch bubble to enough units. That said, OBR likes sending in Cav to go pin units in their deployment zone and to keep them from taking objectives and just target them a bit. Depending on how they deploy, he might not be able to, even with running like that, be able to keep that bubble up. So that's something to keep in mind. But 18 inches, holier than 18 inches or just 18, is kind of his magic number, as we're going to see with the next thing. He's got another ability, Aviarch Spymaster, which comes from like one of the dudes on his base that's helping him, his like cadre of guys that are helping him out. But it's a 5+ negate enemy command. I don't know if we have a name for that ability, but basically, once per turn, not per battle round, but per turn, if your opponent declares a command for a unit within 18, not wholly then, you get to roll a dice. On a 5-up, the command has no effect. It still counts as having been used, and the command points spent to use it are still lost. So that's nice. It's a nice ability. I wouldn't say it's the main reason you're taking him, and it's easy to forget, but you also have to choose wisely because you can only use it once per turn. I thought I put this on here. Oh, I did put it on. I just skipped over it. +3 control score for holier than 18. So that's the prime Necrophoros, or Necrophoros, one or the other. He's adding +3 to the control score of other friendly Ossiarch Bonereapers units while they're holier than 18. The reason I said he's got his control score of 5 is kind of different. He's essentially just an infantry model. He's like a single dude that just happens to have a bunch of guys with him. So one way of looking at it is you could think he's got a normal control 2 for himself, and then his other like 3-ish guys on the base count each as control 1, so that pumps him up to control 5 or whatever. Some math that's kind of like that. Another way of looking at it is control 2, and he's giving himself the buff, but they didn't want to confuse you, so he just got a flat 5, and then he's giving +3 to other OBR units while they're holier than 18. Whatever way you want to look at it, he's not going up to 8. He stays at 5, and he gives +3 to other units, which is great because they want to stay holier than 18 anyway. So considering how elite your army wants to be, he's making sure that you're getting as much body count on objectives as possible. So really nice, that ability. And of course, it's going to have more impact if you're taking MSU units. So as small as possible, not reinforcing. But then again, there's a risk there. So that's not really the kind of meta we're in right now. And then, like I was saying, he's very tanky, that 5th point. He's very tanky, but also very slow. At 20 health, 3 up save, 6 up ward, could easily go to 5 in the combat phase if you choose that part of Relentless Discipline. Or if he's standing around Immortus Guard, which is one of the popular builds, to give him +1 ward at all times until they die or stop being within combat range. And of course, he can give himself +1 save. So he's functionally on a 2 up save. And then if you all defense him, then he's ignoring a point of rend, ignoring rend 1, and staying on a 2 up save. So that's pretty impressive with a 5 up, maybe 4 up ward with the Immortus Guard standing around. And if you also use the Mortisan Soul Reaper and they're in combat with the Soul Reaper, then they're getting -1 to wound as well. So he can be a really tanky boy, but you have to pump a whole lot of stuff into him. And like I was saying about the downside of him not being a caster, means you need a caster in the army for multiple reasons. And then there's the additional tax of now you're taking a Mortis Guard unit, now you're taking a caster. So his actual cost to make him do what he needs to do can skyrocket quite significantly when you could have just been for 110 points less without any of those extra costs been taking Arkhan. And then, like I said on the last point, he kind of wants a Mortis Guard with the +1 ward. Let's look at his output. So Jonas was saying that he felt like Katakros has disappointing output, but he is the best out of these 3. So I guess that's something in terms of raw output. And then in terms of, also in terms of just points, damage per 100 points, he's doing the most, except against the Gothizzar Harvester, which we'll get to shortly. So expected value average, he's got the +1 rend from anti-charge rend, which he's probably getting charged more often than he's charging himself, so that's totally reasonable. +1 to hit, that's like he for some reason has either all at attack on or he's got crit 2 hits. If we go back one slide to look, 2 out of 3 of his weapon profiles have crit 2 hits as well. So that means if you're doing, what's it called? In Power Naderate weapons, only 2 out of 3 of those profiles are getting it. One of which is actually not that great. Those are basically just Mortek Guard that he's got. It's functionally, 5 Mortek Guard worth of output that he's got on his War Scroll there. But his main weapon is the Indicat, which is another one that's receiving the crit 2 hits. Anyway, so if he gets all of those abilities off, he's jumping to about 16 damage against an average save, averaged out save. But, that's okay. It's not like he's not going to punch, but, per 100 points, it's only 2.23. He's 54% better than Nagash per 100 points, 30% better than Arkhan, and 60% worse than a Gothizzar Harvester per 100 points, which has to do with how that's only a 200-point model, and Katakros is 520 points. So out of the 3 War Masters, clearly my favorite is Arkhan, but Katakros is probably the most popular in the meta right now. We'll have to see what happens with the increase in points for not only Katakros himself, but also Death Riders. So I could see it changing, but I think Arkhan is secretly, underrated. But I'd be curious to see what other dedicated OBR people feel about him. Anyway, so let's move on to the not actual heroes, but the still big guys that aren't the endless spells. So that would be first the Gothizzar Harvester. I gave him 1 star, but let's see why. As far as the regiments he can be taken, like which heroes can take him, he can be taken by all unique heroes. That's 5. So that would be the 3 War Masters we just looked at, plus Archcavallo Santos and Vokmorshan. So that's all 5 of the unique heroes available to OBR, plus the Liege Cavallos. So essentially not the Mortisans. The Mortisans can take him 0 to 1. So what do I mean by that? Essentially, everyone can take one of them. And then the first list of guys, the unique heroes and the Liege Cavallos, can take any number of Gothizzar Harvesters they want. That said, you're not going to. I think even taking 1 in the list is probably not a good idea. But let's talk about what he does. So he's, in theory, a recursion source for OBR. That's the idea. He's like this monster that's walking around, picking up dead bodies and reforging them into new OBR models, either Mortek Guard or other things. But he's functionally lacking the support and or rules around him, the synergies, to make this strategy actually work. So let's talk about his abilities, and then we'll talk about what could buff that and maybe lean into it. But he basically stores up points per dead enemy model for a unit that's in combat. Now, this has recently been changed from what you see on the War Scroll here. This is the old War Scroll. I should have used the new one. It didn't occur to me, but I'll explain it now. If you look at the actual War Scroll, it says roll a d3 on a 2-up, inflict an amount of mortal damage on the target equal to the roll. Oh, sorry, I'm reading the wrong rule. That is a rule. Let's finish talking about that. So that's his Rampage. For each model slain by this ability, you can return one slain model to a friendly Mortek guard holy than 12. Okay, so that's his Rampage. That could happen twice per battle round because that can happen in every combat phase. But what I meant to be talking about was the Bone Harvest rule, the passive ability. Each time an enemy model in combat with this unit is slain, give this unit 1 bone type point to a max of 6. They recently changed this to say each time an enemy model in combat with this unit is slain, enemy model whose unit is in combat with this unit. So it used to be that the actual model that was slain had to be in combat with him, as in within 3 inches. But what a smart opponent would do, if it didn't matter them otherwise, they'd pull a model that was in that unit out, but that wasn't within 3 inches of the Gothizzar Harvester. Now they can't do anything about it. As long as he's still in combat with that unit, every time a model gets pulled out, it gives him a bone type point to a max of 6. Then what happens is at the end of any turn, he can use those points to pick a friendly OBR unit that's holy than 12 and return a number of slain models equal with a combined health equal to the bone type point, which means he could have max 6. So that means he could bring back a whole Morghast unit model. He could bring back a whole one of the elite infantry, so Immortus Guard and Necropolis Stalkers. But he can't bring back single wounds. He's not healing. He's only bringing back whole models. So that means if you had 6, the other 2 points are wasted if you bring back a Immortus Guard or Necropolis Stalker. He could bring back up to 2 with 6 points, up to 2, why am I forgetting the names of these guys? The Death Riders. And he could bring back for the Tyrannic Cohort, they each have a wounds characteristic of 2. He could bring back up to 3 of those guys, and he could bring up to 6 back of the Mortek Guard, plus max 3 that he's bringing back from his Rampage. So in theory, every turn he could be bringing back 9 Mortek Guard. Now here's where things start to get funky. First off, a model had to be dead by being in combat with him, and it's only an enemy model. So it used to be friendly units. So if some of your guys died, you got to maybe bring them back. It was like he was churning up the bones and then bringing back. He didn't care whose bones it was. But now he only does it for enemy models, right? Second, he's not super hard to kill. He's 10 health, 4-up save, 6-up ward, probably a 5-up ward if he's around a hero. He actually has good output, which I'll talk about momentarily. But he really wants to be leaning into Mortek Guard, and the problem is Mortek Guard are overpriced for their points, and their abilities don't really synergize with the army the way it used to. You've also got the Mortisan Bone Shaper, which unfortunately is not an Italics hero. None of the Mortisan units are, only the Liege Cavallos is. Or Liege's Cavallos. So you're probably raising your drops unnecessarily by bringing one of those guys. The Bone Shaper only can be using his ability, if I'm not mistaken, once per... No, he might be... I think you can stack it, but it only goes off on a 3-up. And so, to bring back Mortek. So, if you were trying to build a list that's like Gothizzar Harvester plus Mortek Guard plus a Bone Shaper, go for it. I tried to build this list and make it also halfway decent. I think I reiterated that process twice. So there's 1 Harvester, 2 sets of 1 Harvester, 20 Mortek Guard, which is the max size that unit can be, and a Bone Shaper. And then I probably had another hero somewhere in there. I had 2 blocks of that plus maybe some Death Riders or something. It could maybe work, but I just don't think it's really something you're leaning into. And that's max 40 Mortek Guard, which just feels kind of like not enough because they're okay, but like I'd rather take Tyrannic Cohort for like deep strike stuff or whatever. And then there's a sub-faction that lets you, what is it, in your hero phase, or maybe, I forget when the timing is exactly, but essentially you roll a die on a 5-up, you can bring back half of a dead Mortek Guard unit. But obviously it's working against what you're already trying to do because, first off, it's not going off reliably enough on a 5-up. But in addition, one of your units has to be dead, and if you're investing in bringing them back, by having Harvesters and Bone Shapers in your list, then you're running the risk that you don't actually end up losing a unit on time. And then let's say it's not until turn 3 or 4 that you're actually getting to roll on that. So maybe you've got 3 attempts at this, at bringing them back, max, and it only goes off 1 out of every 3 times. So on average, you're bringing half of a 20 unit back, which is 10 guys, which is literally 120 points worth of stuff. And you chose your whole formation to go around that and built your whole list around it, which unfortunately makes me feel that the Harvester is a 1-star unit. It's best to avoid. But let's talk about his melee, just in case you're feeling particularly monstery and want to run for that. And keep in mind he does have a 6-inch move, so he's a little faster. And control 5, which is standard for monster. So if we look at his output, this is scaled to Katakros again, because it's on a 20-point scale. So don't let that fool you on the scale. He's actually not bad for what you're paying for, because he's actually got the best damage per 100 points here at 3.56 on his base profile. If we're looking at his expected value average against, so here I did +1 rend for the anti-charge rend, Relentless Discipline, or whatever other combination of extra rend impact you want to have, like Purple Sun or something. Crit 5, so he's not the worst unit. If you had, like, I don't know, 2 casters, and then you put 1 on a block of Death Riders and then another on him for some reason, maybe you're using that, or all attack, whatever you want to do, but that's functionally +1 to hit, and then both. You're getting up to about 10, almost 10 expected value average against all the saves averaged out, which is fine for a 200-point model. That said, for 200 points, you're also taking 5 Death Riders, or you're taking 3 Immortus Guard. So if he's good, you'd have to compare how good he is compared to those. So keep that in mind. But he's 71% better than Nagash per 100 points. 56% better than Arkhan, 37% better than Katakros. So, he's good relative to his points cost. And then if we zoom up here, this is against infantry. What do I mean by this? So if we scroll back to his war scroll, one more. That, I meant to say this earlier, but that rampage that he's got can only be against enemy infantry unit. And it's the models that you bring back are not based on how many mortal damage he does, it's how many models were slain. So ideally you're doing it into infantry with a wounds characteristic of 1. So Stormcast would not be as ideal for bringing back whole models. But anyway, if he is going to infantry, it puts his output up a little bit. On average, 1 2/3 mortal damage per combat phase. So that means I rescaled the chart down below too. So he's almost 50% better than Katakros per 100 points at that point. I still think he's a 1-star unit. I just think the support in the army is not high enough. I feel like if they changed it so that he would get the points for each one of your Mortek Guard that dies as well, and then maybe, God forbid, he wasn't capped at 6, but say, I don't know, 8, so you could bring back 2 Immortus Guard or 2 Necropolis Stalkers, something like that. I could see that being maybe serious, or 9 even, for bringing back 3 Cavallos would be amazing. I think that might shift it. The problem is he wouldn't be able to keep up with some of those units, so then you're running that risk. Or if they kept it at 6, but you could modularly choose to heal things and bring things back, now I think we're talking. But at this point, I just think he's too hard to make him do what he wants to do. And even though his output's totally fine, it's just not really, I think, that great in the meta right now. So I'm going to say he's our 1-star unit. And I'll go and tell you, I think he's our only 1-star unit in the whole book, or the whole index. Let's move on to our 1 shooting unit, the Mortek Crawler. I've already talked at length about this guy in the video because I covered him, the index review. But at 260 points, I'm calling him a 4-star unit, and I think the meta would support this decision. He's great in a lot of builds. He can be taken by the unique heroes in the same way, and Liege Cavallos in the same way as the Gothizzar Harvester. But his 0 to 1 ability, being able to take in 0 to 1 times, can only be taken by a Mortis and Os Effector. So if you don't have one of those unique heroes or a Liege Cavallos in your list, or an Os Effector, you can't take them without taking an Ox unit, which obviously no one's trying to do. So what's his deal? He's OBR's only real shooting threat, arguably the best artillery output in AOS, and we'll talk about that later in a moment. And then he's got some strike last tech that improves with other crawlers and or ossifectors. So let's look at that rule. Any shooting phase, which means even with the covering fire, you pick an enemy unit that was targeted by all of this unit's shooting attacks this phase. In your opponent's phase for a covering fire, that's implicit because you can't split shots. Covering fire says you have to put all of it into the closest unit. So that's automatically going off. It just means they were targeted. He doesn't even have to have hit or to have done damage or killed something. It's just targeting. And then your turn, you could split the shots up, but if you want to use this ability, you're not going to. And honestly, he's swingy enough that I think you should probably put all of his attacks into one target. But anyway, if you did, those conditions are met, you can roll a die, add 1 to the roll if the unit is wholly within 12 of a friendly ossifector, and further add +1 to the roll if any other friendly Mortek Crawler units picked that enemy unit to be the target of this ability this turn. Any other. So it doesn't keep stacking for each crawler. It just they're giving max an extra 1. On a 4-up, the target has strike last for the rest of the turn. So let's think about what this means. You take 1 crawler. Let's say you have a list with 3 crawlers, because we have a formation that would max out on 3 crawlers. They each are getting +1 to hit if they don't move and they're wholly within your territory. So, crawler 1, all 3 crawlers shoot at the same target. Say you're really dead set on making something have strike last, and let's say you have an ossifector in the list. Crawler 1 shot, and what you can do is you can immediately, before you even shoot, because you can determine the actual order of these abilities that's just in the shooting phase. So you have Crawler 1 shoot at target that you're dead set on having strike last. Okay? After you resolve those shooting attacks, you resolve this shooting phase ability. You have an ossifector standing within range to trigger this. So on a 3-up, that unit has strike last. Then what you can do is you can say, on the basis of what you just saw, maybe you're content. You did enough damage and you weren't really doing it for the damage because he is better against infantry. Say that you're trying to make a cavalry unit like Varangard have strike last. You're like, well, he's not really maxed out against those. I shot with the one guy. I got my desired outcome of having him get to shoot or give them strike last. So now I'm going to have the other 2 crawlers focus down other enemy units. And you can keep one by one focusing down units and seeing if that ability goes off. Let's say it doesn't. So you targeted the first one, the ability doesn't get triggered. Then you decide to have Mortek Crawler number 2 shoot at that same unit of Varangard. And then now they're getting, instead of a 3-up, they're going to a 2-up because they've got the ossifector nearby and another crawler had chosen that other unit for that same ability, which is pretty strong. Obviously, you're not stacking those on your opponent's turn because you're not going to have Mortek Crawlers doing it. But if you have an ossifector in your list, then it's a 3-up in your opponent's turn, which is still really strong. Because obviously they're normally striking first, at least with the normal activation order. So you could be really messing up with their plans. So anyway, it's a great ability. It's fantastic. And his output is actually really, really strong. I already mentioned the 4th point here. He's in the right battle formation, which is Mortek Balistrari, or Starry. Up to 3 of these guys can be getting +1 to hit, which takes them from 4 attacks at 4+ to hit to 4 attacks at 3+, and they have crit 2 hits built in, which functionally feels like mathematically, but swingier, that they're getting going to a 2-up to hit, which essentially means at a 24-inch range, 5-inch movement, but they don't want to have move to get that ability. They're hitting on functionally 2s and 2s, -1 but -2 against infantry, D3 +2 damage for each one that goes through. Keep in mind you've also got Drain Vitality to be giving a target -1 save, which would be functionally pumping it up to -3 rend against infantry, which of course is great, or 2 rend against anything else. And the cool thing about the crit 2 hits, even for covering fire, yes, the hit roll goes to 5s, but that means you're hitting on either 5s or 6s, which means if something does go through, given that you roll a 5 or a 6, 50% of the things that do go through are going to be triggering crit 2 hits, which means that they're going to be adding back a die in there. So let's say you rolled a 5, a 6, and then 2 things that don't go through. Then you're getting 3 hits, which is pretty amazing. So you basically got 50% more output there, which is pretty cool. So anyway, it's pretty neat because you can still actually really destroy some units in a covering fire, even with a -1 to hit. Granted, you're paying 260 points for those 4 attacks. and his melee output is nothing to speak of. But he's relatively fast and or tanky for artillery piece. He's got 12 health, control 5 because he's basically a giant monster, and a 6+ ward, but if he's standing around the right people, it's functionally a 5+ ward in combat. So, pretty neat. And if we look at his output just at shooting, I did not scale this on a 20-point scale, which is why it seems so high. You can see that I've got it ranked from base, so without any buffs, base versus infantry, so for extra rend. Then without the extra rend, but +1 to hit, coming from either an all-out attack or from the Mortek Ballistari, and then with +1 to hit versus infantry, so both. So if you're getting everything off, he's doing on average 9 damage, and it's very swingy. Keep in mind this is an average, but it can do. I've seen one of the catapults do something around 22 damage, which is insane. And it's not super exceptional. I mean, you have to roll some 6s to make that happen, but if they have a bad save and you just get through, it's D3 + 2 damage per shot. So if you're getting 4 through, you're doing some serious work. And so this chart, this average is taking into account not only the average of all the saves, but also the average of how swingy it can be. So just keep that in mind. It can also be disappointingly low, but if you take more in your list, it balances out because of law of large numbers. The reason I gave this 4 stars is because the strike last plus it's just threat range for an army that doesn't have a lot of threat range can do a lot of work. And even in the Katakros list, the strike last is not only defensive, but also the fact that your list is a little slower, or at least your castle, that it's going to be moving along with Katakros, is going to be able to still be delivering some threats from range. I mean, if you use the +2-inch movement with its 5-inch move, you're getting up to 7, +24 is putting you up to 31-inch threat range. Or if you're using, say, Forbidden Powers Soulstream Bridge, and you place him just right next to the bridge, you can teleport him to the next bridge and then be shooting, and then that's obviously even more range. So it can be quite a threat piece. It's, like I said, maybe the best output for an artillery piece in the game, which is why, as a Warp Lightning Cannon aficionado, I decided to scale one Warp Lightning Cannon's output and to show you. Now, to be fair, the Warp Lightning Cannon just went down 20 points to 140 from 160, so they're getting a lot more output per 100 points than the Crawler. But let's look at the chart here. So the base output on the Warp Lightning Cannon, which is doing just straight mortal damage, and I want to say at a 20-inch range, not at 24 anymore, and it only moves 3, so it's definitely got a less of a threat range. Its +1 to hit would be using all-out attack, which you can only use on one of them, so it doesn't scale. Whereas the Mortek Crawler, you're in a Ballistari list, you're easily getting at least 2, because you'd probably bring 2, maybe you bring 3 units that are getting +1 to hit, so it scales better, with more units. You can only overload one Warp Lightning Cannon, so that's the next thing, which increases the amount of dice, but also increases the chance that it could die, and has less wounds, less control score, and the same save but no ward save. And then you could be doing both. So realistically, you're getting one Warp Lightning Cannon with both, and then you're getting the rest that you take with base. So if you look at the output, the base is like 3.5 damage, and then if you're doing everything, it's shooting up to about 9, which is good, and for 140 points is great, but obviously it can kill itself. And I love the Warp Lightning Cannon, don't get me wrong, but ultimately I think the Warp Lightning, the Mortek Crawler is bringing more value, even though it's almost double the points cost. It's doing more damage, not for double the points cost, but it also has more synergy with what your army wants to be doing with Strike Last. And I can say with the Covering Fire, which you can't overload, if I'm not mistaken, you can't overload the Warp Lightning Cannon in your opponent's turn. Even if you can, I'm forgetting off the top of my head, it used to be able to with Unleash Hell. But even if you can, it's hitting on 5s, doing those mortal damage, and then you just be throwing extra dice that it could blow itself up. and it doesn't have crit 2 hits like the Crawler does, which helps make up for that -1 to hit and covering fire. So ultimately, I still stand by that the Mortek Crawler is probably better, especially in mass. If you take multiple instances, they get increasingly better than the Warp Lightning Cannon. But anyway, so there we go. All right, so let's get down to those endless spells, which we'll talk about really quickly. They don't have a points cost, so there's no points per 100 equation here. And we're just going to talk about all 3 of them. I think I listed them in order of which I think how good they are, but obviously if you take them, you're taking all 3. So the Bone Tithe Shrieker is basically giving you a -1 to ward for enemy units just within 12 inches, which is the main reason you're taking it. You set it up outside of 9, and then anything that happens to be between the 12 and those extra 3-inch distance or whatever, just within 12, is getting -1 to ward at all times. So against its own shooting attacks, which it can do the turn it comes into play, unlike endless spells that can't charge or like hit a 9-inch charge or whatever. And it's got decent output for its melee, but you don't really need it to make this thing worth it because you're applying it to, say, what the catapult's doing. If you're shooting with the Mortek Crawler, then they're shooting into something with a ward roll, then it's a -1. Great. For any of your melee units, for any of your mortal damage that you're doing. There's just a lot of utility in this. And it's got such a large range that, I mean, I think it's better than Purple Sun because Purple Sun needs to be at risk of dying, at risk of dying in combat. And this thing doesn't have to be at risk at all. And it's not horrible in combat, although it will die. It does have shooting combat, though, which is nice. So if we take a look at its output, including its shooting output, this is just on a 0 to 6 point scale. We've got its ranged attack, its melee, and then I've got the other 2 guys. So you can see, so the Carrion, the Soul Stealer Carrion, which is the bird, is in green, and then the Predator is in light blue, the Nightmare Predator. You can clearly see which one's better. And since they all have the same points cost and the same casting value, these are actually really good comparisons. But you might say, well, the Shrieker gets to shoot once per battle round and maybe max fight twice per battle round. So maybe we should combine those 2. But the thing is, I think you're probably not trying to send this into combat because then it just gets taken out of the game. I think you're probably trying to keep it kind of just shooting things and hovering around and being a threat with the -1 to ward. So I don't know if you're actually going to be stacking the ranged and the melee. So I would see it mainly as just one or the other. And sometimes melee, but probably not. Yeah, so there you go. Okay, so our next one, I gave it 4 stars, by the way, because that -1 to ward is fantastic. So the Soul Stealer Carrion has better output, which you're seeing here, than what we just looked at. It's almost as good a beat stick as the Predator, and both of these are better than the average endless spell, I would say. They've basically got a monster profile at hitting on 4s and wounding on 2s. This one's got 1 point less of rend, which is why it's worse than the Nightmare Predator, and its damage is swingy. It's a D3, so it could be more, but it could be less. The Nightmare Predator's got just a flat 2. Its ability is for all enemy infantry units within 6 inches, so not within range once you set it up, but after it moves, gets -5 control score. So it doesn't have to be in combat, which is good because it's also equally likely to die. And so the cool thing is you don't even have to put it on the objective. Leave that room for your own dudes or tempt that unit to tempt that enemy unit that's on that objective to walk off that objective to come try to kill this thing maybe. So you just like make sure it tags that unit. It doesn't have to be wholly thin or anything. It just has to tag one model. And then they're getting -5 down to a minimum of 1. So it has less impact on a unit that's less than 5 models or whatever. And then it's essentially a way that this endless spell, which usually doesn't contribute to control scores, is contributing in a way to your ability to control stuff. So it's also pretty good. I like this unit. And it's a little bit faster. It's plus 2-inch movement from the average flying endless spell. Okay. And then lastly, I gave it 3 stars, by the way, because I think it's decent. But it really they're worth 0 points. But what we're really trying to measure here is the trade-off, the utility cost, essentially, of what you could have been taking, which is Forbidden Power or Primal Energy or maybe Morbid Conjuration, depending on, or the Incarnate, depending on how many casts you've got and what your cast bonuses look like. But I do think this is one of the best faction endless spell collections, Manifestation Lores. Okay, Nightmare Predator is basically just a beat stick. He's got the, I guess, best output of the three because he's got Rend 2. And he's the most consistent because he's got damage 2. He can come back on a 4-up. So end of any turn, if he was banished or destroyed that turn, you get to roll, and the wizard that summoned him is still on the field. On a 4-up, you get to set him up again, wholly within 12 of the wizard and outside of 9 of enemy units. So that's pretty amazing because he basically has 50% as much staying power as it looks like he has. And he could just keep staying on the field. That said, because of the way opponents are getting +1 to banish for every endless spell that's on the field, him being on the field might give them a +1 to banish that they're going to use against you to help get rid of the Shrieker. The Bone Tithe Shrieker, which is giving the -1 ward. So there could be a trade-off there, but you don't have to use that ability, by the way. So if you thought that was a problem, then you could just choose not to. Anyway, he's also moving like the other two, which is one of the advantages of this spell lore, is that when you set them up, you could send them off into corners, really, and just go block off deep strikes and teleports. That said, they did change with a recent FAQ. They did change that endless spells are no longer like limiting the setup range of other moving endless spells. So if they wanted to set a Kronspine in combat with it, they could. But it's not blocking, or it is blocking off normal units that are teleporting or deep striking. And then, like I said, his output is decent at roughly 4, on average, 4 damage against all saves equaled out. He's also a 3-star, in my opinion, because it's good. It's just a good endless spell lore, but I don't think that you're necessarily having to take this, considering how good the other ones I mentioned are. So, weigh everything up. But it's a cool set of models, and I think they add a lot of value. And for teams, that's also a good one. If Forbidden Power and the Kronspine and Morbid Conjuration are all being taken by other teams, you can't double up on the manifestation lores. This is a perfectly acceptable option as your option, especially with the Bone Tithe Shrieker. So that's it, guys. It went a little longer than I thought it was going to, but I hope you guys appreciate how thorough it is. I also was thinking about doing a comparison of Nagash, taking a list that only has Nagash versus a list that has the combo of the other two War Masters, so the Mortarks, Arkhan, and Katakros, because they kind of do, together they almost kind of make a sort amalgam Nagash, if you will, with amazing relentless discipline and defensive abilities plus amazing casting and speed. So I've actually done kind of a side-by-side comparison of those two. And with Katakros going up 20 points and Nagash going up 20 points in OBR, the points differential is the same. I think it's a 30-point differential between taking the two Mortarks. So maybe and then Nagash. So I if you guys are interested in that, let me know, and I'll do a video just dedicated to that as like a bonus at the end of this. But anyway, that's it. What do you guys think? What do you guys think? Are the OBR players out there? Do you agree with me about the star ratings? Was I too generous in some places, too critical of some things in other places? I only gave 1 star, no 2s, and the rest is 3s or higher. So let me know what you're thinking. Next up will be cavalry and elites, and then the video after that will be infantry. And in the meantime, happy holidays for everyone out there, and thanks again for watching. Share the video, and I'll see you guys next time. Ryan out.